Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which time you're joining us from. We're really excited and grateful that you have decided to join us for this workshop, Heritage Out of Control, Waste, Spirits and Energies. My name is Sarawit Debale, one of the organizers, along with my colleagues and friends, Annika and Shishek. The spirit of welcoming you and setting the scene for what promises to be a really exciting 3 days conversation and exchange ahead of us. We would like to say a few opening remarks, and from there we proceed to everything else that unfolds. So this workshop emerged out of a conversation between 3 colleagues who were grappling with the question of binaries and how to go past them. Shishek and I just returned from the field in the spring of 2020 and started reflecting on our observations about what states or secular institutions regard as heritage and how it starkly contradicts with the way in which everyday people relate to them. In my case, my entry point was an annual ritual called Irecha, celebrated in Ethiopia, that brings thousands of pilgrims who do not necessarily see it as heritage. Or if they saw it as one, they did so as embodied and mobile. In a way, they are it. They also see the ritual as a point of interaction between humans and the divine. On the other hand, the state defines it through its authorized experts as heritage that symbolizes the Oromo national identity, downplaying its spiritual value. In Shishek's case, it was about a museumized and therefore culturalized religious site of Mevlana Rumi, while the Turkish government defines it as part of the Islamic heritage and UNESCO promotes it as a world's cultural common. But the visitors come to the Mevlana Museum to merge with the energies of spiritual love. Here we were confronted with the tensions between the materialized, the mobile, and the embodied conceptions against the backdrop of what is conventionally thought of as heritage. But instead of trying to resolve this tension, we opted for asking new questions that account for the tensions and contradictions underlying this puzzle.
While grappling with the boundaries between secular, religious, and spiritual, and how power plays out in these processes, Annika joined our conversation, introducing more questions to unsettle established narratives through the prism of potential of waste in relation to heritage. Occupied with questions of when heritage becomes waste and when wastelands turn into heritage sites, Annika pushed the conversation on materiality and disposability. With her provocations, not only material decay and ruination became part of our thinking, but also the geographical framework of our discussion extended to Europe, with her ongoing doctoral research drawing on her fieldwork in Austria. Heritage Out of Control was conceived in these continuous processes of thinking together. How can we expand our thinking beyond categorical divides? How do we account for the multiple ways of relating to heritage sites? And what happens to heritage when we take spirits, energies, and other non-human actors serious? From these questions germinated the idea that heritage, commonly understood as a means to control and curate the past and the future, is in fact rather out of control if we allow expansion. With these questions at the heart, we developed the idea of facilitating a rather intimate conversation, inviting scholars who are as much as preoccupied with categorical and territorialized thinking as we are. And we are extremely excited that the intimacy we imagined went out of control, and our call has attracted a vibrant group of scholars with diverse disciplinary and geographical backgrounds.
Our call to explore the beyonds and in-betweens of heritage by moving past the tangible-intangible divide as well as by critically attending to the power relations present in spatial frameworks of thinking, rests on our motivation to go beyond examining the constructed and invented nature of heritage, as emphasized by scholars such as Birgit Meyer. Thinking about how waste as a different kind of legacy unsettles established notions of heritage, we encountered Anne Berg's work, who's exploring waste as a perspective to analyze the genocidal practices of Nazi Germany. We are privileged that these two prominent scholars in the field have accepted our invitation to give keynote lectures. Anne Berg will speak about garbage and genocide later today, and Birgit Meyer's talk on Wednesday focuses on disturbing heritage. The numerous responses we received to our call broadened even more the horizons of our questions we initially had in mind, by putting heritage into conversation with war, environmental destruction, commemoration, and aesthetics. We are inspired by the wide geographical and thematic scope of the workshop, which keeps us away from reproducing binaries, but instead look for entanglements. Although the contributions engage with interconnected issues, we tried our best to assemble them thematically.
So accordingly, on our first day, the two panels, Heritagising Waste and Revisiting Wasteland, take us on a tour from the Middle East to Europe and the Americas, dealing with questions of entangled pasts, of violent conflicts, and the remains of wars. The contributions in both panels engage the ambivalent legacies of Wasteland, through which they rethink heritage, taking into account non-human actors. The discussions on wasted heritage and waste as heritage will keep us occupied in the first panel of our second day, with a slight detour to the sacred realm and the idea of heritage in motion. Here in our panel, Heritage in Motion, Heritage in Motion, we have contributions from Africa, Asia, and the Americas, which delve into questions of speciality and perhaps also mobilities of heritage.
We then come to sensing heritage through contributions that account for affect, energy, spirit, ritual-related matters on cases from diverse geographies. Here we hope to push the limits of the secularity of heritage regimes. And on our last day, we will be occupied with forms of the museum as an ultimate representational place that operates as a converter into heritage. In Museum and its malcontents, we deal with how the frames of inheritance are shaped through museum and curatorial processes that are operationalized in making the previously insignificant into an exhibited object. The second panel, Haunted Legacies, will examine the afterlives of supposedly ended power regimes by taking up the issues of the agency of the no longer. It enlarges our thinking about space and time through cases where the coexistence of multiple temporalities are shaping the modes of governance. Both panels of the day bring cases from areas ranging from Europe to Middle East and to Africa.
So once again, we welcome you to what promises to be an inspiring and highly productive 3 days. Having said this, we would like to thank all of those who supported us in the realization of this workshop. Special thanks are due to Birgit Zippel, Marina Cisilski, and Jeremy Walden, as well as Kinai Oljaitu for her artworks. As you've already seen in the final program, there are 10 minutes for each of the 4 presentations, which will then be followed by 10 minutes of comments from the discussant and 30 to 40 minutes for general discussion. You may either write your questions and comments in the chat box or simply indicate that you have a question by noting this in the chat box or use the hand raising button. Once the chair gives you the floor, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So thank you everyone for being here, and I will hand over now to Jelena, who's chairing the first panel.
Oh, sorry. From very stormy Göttingen at the moment. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first panel of today called Heritagising Waste. So today's speakers will, or this panel speakers will be Katarzyna Williams of the Australian National University, who will present on recycled memory, human bones as inherited waste of Central Europe. Then Alice von Bieberstein of Humboldt University of Berlin, Center for Anthropological Research on Museums and Heritage, who will present on waste, copious and plentiful. KNAW of NIOD as Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. And lastly, Regina Bendix, who will of Georg August University of Göttingen, whose paper is titled Blasting Bombs. The discussant of the panel will be Anne Berg of University of Pennsylvania. As Annika already mentioned, there will be 10-minute presentations followed by 10 minutes of the discussant's remarks, and then we will move on to the floor will be open to discussion. And so without further ado, we can start with Dr. Williams.
Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. Thank you to the organizers and to all the participants for having me today. I am very honored to open the workshop, and at the same time, I feel quite, scared, is it the right word? I need to be the first one to talk, especially that I'm not really a heritage scholar, which but more my background is in literature and memory studies. But this project is something I wanted to do for a very long time, and it has been kind of touching on my research interest, but never coming close enough. And when I saw the call for papers for the workshop, I thought that must be it. I need to try to go ahead and actually look into it. And so it became a kind of exercise in thinking about collective memory and I guess my own individual memory, perhaps a tangible, intangible heritage as well. It's a very early draft, although I've been thinking about it for some time. So I'll reflect on the memory of an encounter with human bones in the context of intergenerational remembering I'm part of. In terms of location, I'm focusing on a city in Western South Poland, former German city, Breslau, that does not often feature in the narratives of two totalitarian regimes that frame the memory landscape of post-war Poland. In spite of all the atrocities of war that also touched the city, Breslau remained as a city untouched by the war till the very beginning of 1945. Only in the very last weeks of the war, everything changed. The city turned to rubble. Its population was entirely replaced, and its political, economic, cultural structures shattered. It's a complex and contentious memory space, I believe. On the one hand, it's one of those concrete places and examples that are given now by various commentators as an example, as a model of how to deal with a difficult past. On the other hand, it is the space in which individual memories of materially experienced absences still cause tensions in determining the identity of the place and its inhabitants. I consider myself inhabitant of Wrocław, although I don't live there I haven't been there for quite some time. Wrocław is a German city that became Polish at the end of the war in 1945 as a result of moving the borders westwards to compensate to Poland's loss of territories to the Soviet Union. The border shifts resulted in massive expulsions and population transfers. Expelled ethnic Germans were replaced by settlers displaced by the Soviets, and Soviet annexation of the Eastern European borderlands. Breslau experienced one of the most radical transformations in Europe history. Nearly, at least 70% of its population was replaced within a very short period of time. Gregor Thum reflects on this population shift as a deeply disturbing experience for both sides. New inhabitants, having lost their own homes in the East, quote, came to a city completely strange to them, while the German had to leave a place that had become foreign to them. The new inhabitants of Breslau were rootless and homesick, horrified by this kind of sense of unfamiliarity of a place, its strangeness, and they were determined to de-Germanize the city, remove all the traces that reminded them about the war, about the trauma, about their own homesickness. They tried to cope with their inheritance in various ways, cleaning piles of rubble from the streets, changing or translating street names, rebuilding or redesigning city spaces, taking down statues, also enforcing narrative of regained territories and their journey as returning home. Everything to get rid of this sense of strangeness and the other. Cemeteries are quite an interesting example here. In 1957, the communist government made a decision to close pre-war German cemeteries in the Western lands. For the next 10 years, the cemeteries were liquidated. And while liquidation of cemeteries and graves is a natural process in probably every country, in Wrocław, due to the politics and top-down decision of the authorities, but also probably the indifference of the post-war inhabitants of the city, it became a horrific process of imposing oblivion, silence, a sort of strategic forgetting we know from other parts of the world as well. Once the Iron Curtain collapsed in 1989, everything started to gradually change. Attention was drawn to the fate of the destroyed German cemeteries and heritage generally, and numerous initiatives were undertaken to restore the memory, the knowledge. In my more developed paper, I would like to give some of the example of these initiatives and activities. I find them quite interesting. But for now, what I'm interested is this process that is parallel to this, or that is happening at the same time, and it's quite different. My generation, which means mid-late 1970s, was growing up in a new Polish city, but the border shift, population replacement, and this strategic forgetting, and perhaps this common indifference left their mark. We've experienced the past as waste. For example, tombstones were recycled into fences, paving slabs, and other building materials. I could see the names and dates crossing the street, names and dates of deceased people I was not aware of. But this past experience as waste also comes in a more kind of shocking way, let's say, also as human bones, nameless, redundant, discovered, for example, in excavations for heat pipes of the new housing development where I lived, where I played, and what I experienced, and together with my friends of, I don't know, maybe 8 years old. They were coming up during road works, as for example, not so long ago, a couple of months ago, also not far from where I used to live. These human bones were obviously out of place, both in the context of the location where they were found, and in a broader picture of my sense of home. We had no context in which these bones could be assembled and make sense. They were kind of surplus waste. They were no longer meant to make sense. But they were also a burden. something that cannot be ignored or simply disposed of. They could be somebody. They were somebody. The ambivalent agency of human bones, considered uneasy object-subjects, brings attention to this tension between affective presence and absence, which resonates in the fact that material evidence, in this case, implies absence, but also in a bigger context that material evidence finds no support in the narrative of home. There is no story for me behind it, or there was no story behind it. So I started to think how to think about this effective presence and absence of human bones. The past whose absence is manifest, or perhaps this is the term I borrowed from another scholar, Domańska. It destabilizes the image of home and undermines the sense of the familiar. It complicates the tangible and intangible heritage divide on several levels, I think, as this uneasy object-subject also is something that misses the story. It's covered by the strategic forgetting, silences, oblivion, also as something which no longer confront us in their materiality, is hidden, removed, covered with new roads, parks, shops, kindergartens, as waste. The perception of human bones as waste directs, perhaps, I don't know, I'm thinking about it, our reflection towards this articulate, nameless, redundant heritage. Applying such a lens enables us, again, perhaps, to dismantle the materiality of heritage, rethink contentious past and events, and reflect on what it is actually that we have inherited. There are other questions that keep coming. What is our responsibility towards this inherited waste? What is exactly that we need to remember, and how? How to use ambiguous status of human bones as the means through which we approach the other. How can we develop pluralist identities that do not put us in one single category? It's particularly in the context of Polish-German past, talking about the category of a victim, perpetrator, bystander, etc. So these are just a few of the questions that were coming up when I was drafting this draft. And I believe there will be more to deal with when I actually start developing it more, and hopefully thanks to your suggestions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was a great introduction to this very unsettling theme. We will now go on to Dr. Alice von Bieberstein.
Okay, I thought, sorry, I had understood that there was always going to be a 10-minute kind of, but this will come at the end. So I just continue. Okay, sorry. I was like, I misunderstood that. Okay, then yes. Well, first of all, thank you, Annika and Zicek and Seravit for the invitation. And I would like to share my screen. God, where is it? There we go. Okay, now I need to. Okay, does this work now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. All right. So let me just start. Waste is the material and conceptual shadow of heritage. So much is clear, at least in the case of material structures that have suffered from processes of ruination. The discursive and institutional declaration of something as heritage sets it apart from what then comes to appear as mere ruin, or not even that if we follow Gordillo, but rather rubble and debris, in short, waste. Waste, writes Kathleen Miller, is that which lacks being and value, and which is thoroughly enmeshed in processes of racialization. but this will only be of concern for us indirectly today. Rather, what I want to focus on is how waste shadows heritage in a way that parallels how the value of destruction shadows the value of conservation. Starting in April 1915, the Armenian population of the late Ottoman Empire was systematically murdered, mainly, but not only, by being marched to death along deportation routes from different regions of what is now the Republic of Turkey towards the Syrian desert. I'm saying not only because in the region where I conducted fieldwork, many were not deported, but killed on the spot, often by being rounded up in churches and barns and burned alive. Buildings were thus themselves weaponized in a way that turned the destruction of the built environment from the beginning into a central part of the killings themselves. Following the removal of the Armenian population, local Kurds and refugees from other parts of the empire quickly settled in the emptied villages. Sometimes houses and communal buildings, such as schools, were taken apart and their constituent parts reassembled into other buildings or left as debris to lose their distinct object form. Many larger structures, especially churches and monasteries, were outright destroyed, blown up, or used as military training grounds. Some were repurposed and converted into mosques or used as stables and barns. Armenian symbols, crosses, and inscriptions were forcefully removed, scratched out, or painted over. Those few structures that were neither destroyed nor repurposed or built over were left unattended and uncared for, abandoned to the slow violence of neglect. Armenian material remains in what is known as Eastern Turkey or Northern Kurdistan or Western Armenia have thus been laid to waste as part of a process of genocidal destruction, which always also aims at erasing its own traces. The destruction has served to deny that Armenians ever lived on these lands, and hence the genocidal violence was unleashed upon them. Flanked by a series of legal and administrative provisions, it was also meant to prevent the return of survivors and a possible cultural reconstitution of an Armenian community outside Istanbul after the genocide. As Jelena has convincingly demonstrated in the case of Northern Cyprus, the ruinous and wasted as that which is abjected is not necessarily that which is expelled or excluded from the symbolic and political order. As I've described, wastage goes hand in hand with appropriation and repurposing, which permits to lay the waste to waste and cover up the violence. Waste can be disappeared and the abject thereby integrated. Much of the material evidence of Armenian communal existence is that not even visible, disturbingly, as waste. It is simply not there at all, but has been transmorphed into something else that no longer irritates through an abject negative quality. At the same time, though, processes of destruction and erasure are rarely comprehensive or complete. Things escape, are left out or forgotten, while violent destruction itself creates certain forms of excesses, which appear in this case in the intimate space of encounter between state and local population. While much of the work of initial large-scale destruction was carried out by state and military agents and broad sections of the population engaged in occupation, appropriation, and reconstruction, this work was displaced over time onto what are called definiciler in Turkish treasure hunters. These operate with the tacit approval of state forces and thus in a relationship of complicity, despite being themselves structurally discriminated and often persecuted on account of being Kurdish, at least in my case. Treasure hunters in the region in which I worked search for Armenian treasures and gold, which they believe Armenians to have buried near their homes and other related sites, as means of safekeeping, urgently so under conditions of general insecurity during the late Ottoman period, and then at last when faced with deportation. Beyond a structural integration of the abject, which domesticates the effects of violence in a way that also normalizes what is essentially a necropolitical landscape, we find treasure hunters animating this very landscape, and particularly sites of former Armenian settlements, including cemeteries. From their perspective, Armenian material remains appear not so much in material forms, although they can, but more often than not, they appear as force fields, charged places, or objects, or piles that forcefully attract, also through their indeterminate state between thing and nothing, or waste. Treasure hunters wander this landscape, and search for symbols and marks and hidden clues which can appear on stones and rocks or in the shape of particular stone and rock formations. Indeterminacy plays an important part in this cosmology as condition of possibility for turning the land into one of potential riches. It is flanked by vernacular religious beliefs in jinn, magic, and spell breaks, which forms part of a larger set of tools and strategies assembled to wrest some degree of control from this general situation of uncertainty and indeterminacy. Treasure hunters thus imagine the land of historical Armenia to be filled with riches, buried underground or hidden within walls or other material assemblages, which speaks of a particular imagination of these former Armenian inhabitants as essentially wealthy. In local conversations, Armenians are remembered as the productive and urban elements of the region, as artisans and merchants connected to Europe and beyond through powerful trade networks. This stands in stark contrast to the brutal realities of dispossession and disempowerment that plagued the provinces in the late 19th century and culminated in the genocide of 1915-16 and beyond. It also creates a powerful contrast to the contemporary devastation, destruction, and impoverishment that drives the very search for treasures and gold. Treasure hunters target more obvious structures such as churches and former monasteries whose walls they perforate and hollow out. But they also search in the vicinity of such buildings or around parts of the land known to have been once sites of Armenian settlements, but where nothing much remains. They dig up soil, break up rocks, and go through rubble and debris. They seek to profit from the remains of the remains, from what has not been integrated. I understand treasure hunting to constitute a necro-speculative practice that assumes a certain wealth of resources in the land to emerge from the state's foundational violence. It cannot be understood independently of the great transfer of wealth that constituted the economic dimension of the Armenian genocide. As a number of historians have worked out over the course of the last decades, the killing of the Ottoman Armenian population went hand in hand with a massive project of dispossession and appropriation that aimed at facilitating and consolidating the formation of a national economy in the hands of an emerging Muslim bourgeoisie. The expropriation of Armenians was absolutely comprehensive. The only objects or assets that escaped this work of dispossession were, on the one hand, life insurance policies that had been issued to Ottoman Armenians by large Western insurance companies, and on the other hand, those valuables that had indeed been buried underground. Treasure hunters more than 100 years after the event can thus be said to chase after the promise that was issued to perpetrators and bystanders during the genocide, namely that destruction would be generative of value for those who would thereby inadvertently bind themselves to the project of nation building, if intention, contradiction, or even exclusive inclusion. Treasure hunters project wealth and plenty onto or into the ground and the walls of former Armenian settlements and approach them as sites of economic opportunity for the extraction of value, even if this endeavor is mostly bound to fail. The material remains of Armenian communal existence are thus enmeshed in both genocidal destruction and value extraction, in processes of annihilation and efforts at mattering and presencing. There is a temporal space of indeterminacy that connects the two, which is what I referred to above as the slow violence of neglect. This violence is also a strategic element of emerging politics and practices of heritage. Long left out of national heritage and tourism programs, peripheral provinces like the one where I conducted fieldwork have, over the last few decades, been encouraged to develop, also by investing in heritage and tourism infrastructure. Given their marginal position, general underdevelopment, and lack of funding, these investments have, in any event, been very timid. Unsurprisingly, they prioritize sites and objects that fit the hegemonic narrative. In the mid-2010s, though, against the background of increasing numbers of Armenian tourists, plans were initiated locally to restore the remains of the great Surp-Garabet monastery. Yet this is not so easy. Not only was it destroyed during military training in the early Republican period, it has also attracted a number of migrants and refugees who settled and slowly transformed what was once a large and majestic monastery into an almost normal village. As Armenian remains have thus come under the radar of heritage, a dilemma emerges, or rather a friction or tension between the twin impulses of destruction and profiteering. While violence goes into the labor of converting the already ruined and wasted into potential profit, it might become a problem when the aim is to profit from a reconstitution of such ruined remains as heritage. I opened my presentation with the argument that waste shadows heritage in a way that parallels how the value of destruction shadows the value of conservation. In short, while heritage makes possible process of commodification through the conferral of value, these efforts at conservation are always shadowed by not only by what is left out or left over, but also by how these remains in turn become the objects of extraction. As Kathleen Miller has argued, it is important to attend to the materiality of waste, to stay with the garbage, so to speak. As I've tried to show, it permits, in my case, through the prism of treasure hunting, which produces waste through projections of plenty, to highlight how Armenian material remains are entangled in both genocidal violence and a post-genocidal political economy that continues to try to benefit from the necropolitical character of the land. Thank you very much for this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation and really fascinating visuals. We now turn to the waste of war and Dr. Tamno.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to this wonderful workshop. I am not a student, well, I am a new student of heritage study or waste study, namely because these are not the central part of my research until now, but I am personally more affected also as someone who studied the legacy of war. And in Vietnamese, humanistically, these three terms, waste, heritage, and legacy are connected. So let me try to make it out, to work it out in this this connection today. Let me try to share my screen, and I apologize for perhaps not so nice image that I will share. It might appear a little bit too graphic for your taste, so I might apologize in advance. Let's see. Have you seen? Oh, that is not supposed to be the one. Yeah, in the beginning. Okay. So, can you see it well? It's okay? Okay, good. Thank you. Now, the legacy of wars is immense in Vietnam. The remains of hundreds of thousands of missing and unidentified bodies, generations disabled by dioxin exposure, vast territories contaminated by toxic and explosive materials, among others, are metaphorically and literally the waste of war in Vietnam. Some of this waste has been turned into heritage. Military waste, enshrined as martyrs, have paved way for a vast array of monuments, memorials, pilgrimage, and spiritual sites. The heritage of war waste is part of Vietnam's rapid expanding dark tourism as the country follows the global trends of museumizing and commercializing the memory of violence. But not all war waste is recyclable, nor is the recycling process clean and complete. New waste, toxicities, and the hauntings of the past are often the side effect. This paper aims to offer a reflection about humans and non-human form of war waste and about the heritage that escaped the state controls. It does so by analyzing two ethnographic cases that deal with the state scientific attempts to deal with the remnants of the past and the unintended consequences of these attempts. And in this paper, I try to raise the question about spiritual and material heritage in relation to the continuities of bodily remains. Oh, what happened here? Well, the Vietnamese state honor 1.2 million soldiers who died fighting for its establishment and preservation with the title martyrs. Their death is hailed as the most sacred, ultimate, and heroic sacrifice to which the state vows to remember forever and to reward the remains of the dead with the utmost care. In the face of the missing remains and unattended grace, Vietnam have seen the proliferation of dynamic forms of spiritual responsibility and localized ritual care for the dead. According to traditional Vietnamese belief, the dead can be contacted through spirit possession and soul calling. This practice, which the state considered superstition and anti-science, was banned, but in the late 1990s were legalized as spiritual forensics to recover the remains and the identity of the war dead. The success of spiritual forensic eventually challenged the state, officially still a atheist communist country, and made them in 2013 begin to import top-notch DNA-based forensic technology to find and identify their fallen soldier. Due to various problems, both technical and political, the DNA-based identification project in Vietnam faced dead end only several years after it began. In 2019, more than 5,000 pieces of bones, human bones, they are sample of unknown soldier, piled up at the government office after they were tested at different labs without success. As leftovers of both science, the DNA testing labs, and of a necro society, these tiny and fragile fragments of human remains weigh so heavily on the psyche of the living who have to deal with them, that a sacred shrine have to be built to house them. The Vietnamese spirit medium reflect this development with gruesome details about new type of martyr spirits who complain about the new injury on their posthumous body because of the practice of extracting pieces of bone to grind for DNA testing. So 5 years after DNA forensics were brought in to battle the rampant use and abuse of spiritual care for the dead in 2019, the state officially have to again resort to spiritual care, however temporary they say it is. The second case I would like to share with you is a case of a victim of the Agent Orange in Vietnam. So in the middle of the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City, in the center of the permanent exhibition of Agent Orange, lays a special artifact, a tiny coffin made of glass. Curling inside the coffin are 3 stillborn babies, twins, who are attached at the chest and torso, and another baby with split lips. These are signs of genetic defects caused by dioxin exposure that the parents suffer. Surrounding the coffins are photographs of victims of Agent Orange, multiple deformed babies, some already died and many are still alive, and the wounded environments of Vietnam. Being displayed there as victims of Agent Orange, these stillborn babies are among the museum's inventories prized artifacts, testifying against American war crimes. But as human remains, these stillborn babies are the darkest attractions in this museum of dark tourisms. They haunted both museum workers and tourists. Inspired by the story of the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the museum since 2010 housed these stillborn babies in a glass coffins. While their bodies might still be monstrously distorted by the monstrosity of war, these babies, in the museum workers' imagination, are beautiful and innocent princes and princesses. Laying in these glass coffins to capture the gaze of tourists, their beauty shall shine over all ugliness of human world and compels a promise never again to war. I want people to look at these babies as human beings, not as museum artifacts, say Mrs. Sung, the museum directors. From spiritual side, I wish that they shall rest in peace. She used the Buddhist term to wish for a transcendental freedoms and good reincarnation for this baby. Cầu cho các em được siêu thoát. A spiritual outcomes conditioned on a proper burials and a familiar ritual care for these babies. That being said, as an ambitious director of this important state museum, she couldn't help but contradict herself. Instead of hoping for an end to the state use of these poor babies, and their bodies. Mrs. Sung wished that there will be one day financial means to replace this glass coffin with crystal, because crystal will last forever, but that also means that these bodies, these babies, will be forever kept and trapped in this state of limbo. One cannot help but wonder who is the lucky one. These three babies in a crystal, with a crystal coffin waiting for them, or the rest of their former roommates, though other babies who was not selected for the exhibition after 2010. What happened to them? Did they receive a burial, or were they kept for further academic and political use? Rumor has it that it is the second scenario, as Vietnam still has plenty use for these bodies, especially their mutated genetic properties. As the country's negotiation with the US for reparation and redress for Agent Orange related damage is just at the beginning. Dioxin contamination resulted from the US intensive spraying and dumping of Agent Orange in Vietnam in the late 1960s has been the largest bone of contention in the US-Vietnam post-war relationship. In the early 1990s, the US government has already acknowledged and compensated for the destructive effects of Agent Orange on American veterans that served in Vietnam, but only in 2020, so 30 years later, the US finally acknowledged the similar effect of these chemical weapons on not only the environment, but also on the health of the population of Vietnam. Financial and technical commitments were made to support Vietnam's effort for detoxification. Why the political story behind this development is certainly interesting. It is important to reflect on the consequence of this new international cooperation for the people whose lives are affected by dioxins. Here the question is to what extent the expert knowledge with all the scientific research findings to establish a causal links between dioxin contamination and health problem have to confirm or challenge what indigenous knowledge has already established. To what extent has new knowledge produced by scientific research, especially in genetic science, eased some old fears, but at the same time generated new ones? How do people who have no choice but to live in a contaminated environment envision the future and reinterpret past sorrows? How much is the calculation for damage, especially scientific research, establish the indeterminate natures of chemical destruction that span not only spatial but also temporal dimension? How much is enough? To conclude, this paper highlights the ways in which the necropolitics of Vietnamese state handle the remains of fallen soldiers and the genetic consequence of biological warfare. This effort cannot be seen as separate from the makings of official heritage and its conflicts with living memories and the search for those who were lost. While science is invoked to transcend the murder of present in a search for truth, it cannot lay to rest the troubled heritage of Vietnam's violent past. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this compelling, if disturbing, presentation.
Okay, so our second panel, Revisiting Wasteland, we'll start with a presentation by Pamela Klassen of University of Toronto, commemorating the lucky strike, how the environmental destruction of gold mining is remediated through museums, followed by Annika Kirbis from Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity and the University of Utrecht, who will be speaking on following the brick, Unruly Imperial Legacies and Heritagisation in Vienna. You all have such wonderfully long titles that make it difficult to pronounce. Then our next presentation will be Heidi Aronson Kolk from Washington University in St. Louis, reclaiming New York's Heart Island as a site of negative heritage. And finally, Jelena Romashko from Georg August University of Göttingen, Chernobyl as Heritage, Waste, Energies, and Spirits of the Exclusion Zone. Each presenter will have around 10 minutes. And after all the presentations, Marian Burkhardt of Leipzig University will give his remarks as a discussion. So I think Pamela Klassen can start.
Great, thank you so much. I'll just share my screen and can you see, you don't see presenter view, right? You just see the big picture of the golden fleece mining cup. Okay, thank you so much. Oops, went too fast. Now I have to find my paper, which okay, there we go. Okay, thank you so much. I'm really so excited to be here, and it's already been such a rich conversation.
Now we see your paper.
Oh, do you? Excellent. How do I get out of that? Didn't used to do that when I taught. I'm gonna try and get out of something. Hang on.
You have to only share the app and not your screen. When you share, you have the option. It looks the same, but one is share PowerPoint and the other one is share your screen. If you share your screen, then we see exactly what you see. If you share the app, we only see PowerPoint, no matter what you do.
Let's test it. Can you just see that? Can you see my paper now?
No.
Excellent. It's always a new learning curve. I'm very sad that Anne had to leave us to de-prezi her presentation, but we're clearly figuring it out. We're all figuring it out as we go, and I can't wait till we can actually sit in a room together. Thank you so much to the organizers and to Marion for reading our papers and the other papers in this session. Really excited. So I think my paper is actually, I rewrote parts of it. I'm the chair of my department, so I've been doing a lot of bureaucratic writing lately. So it's incredibly exciting to write an actual academic paper, but I realized I didn't actually finish it. So thank you very much for reading what I did send you. So I'm going to actually tie into the context of personal memory and the sort of state control and lack of control in what I present. So gold, I'm working on this project on gold. Gold is definitely a metal of memory. You slip it onto a ring finger and it marks a vow until death do us part. You hammer it into a crown. Now this is supposed to work. Let's see. There we go. You hammer it into a crown and it declares the extravagant boldness and shimmering fragility of sovereignty incarnated into a woman or a man, Queen Elizabeth II here. The memories preserved by gold also take on more infrastructural duties in our computer circuit boards, our cell phones, as gold is both an excellent conductor of electricity and resists corrosion. And to physically extract gold has always been hard work in which the actual laborers, the people who do the work, rarely prosper. These days, people hope for a lucky strike not only by panning, sluicing, dredging, or digging for gold in mines, they also search through piles of cast-off cell phones and laptops to retrieve the tiny amounts of gold hidden within them, exposing themselves to many of the same toxic chemicals that miners did in the gold rushes of the 19th century, including cyanide and mercury. Here's a picture of a gold mining theme park in New Zealand. Which was also the first image as well. Despite the environmental destruction and devastation to human health, the toxic remainders of gold mines have often become state-supported sites of heritage and public memory across the British Commonwealth. These kinds of things are everywhere. Well, maybe not everywhere, but there's a lot of them. This paper is part of a wider project in which I ask why there is such an intensive infrastructure of gold mining memory throughout North America, Australia, and New Zealand. And why do tourism entrepreneurs pour resources into theme parks where children and adults can sit on their haunches to reenact the excruciatingly tedious process of panning for gold? I did this as a child often. I have my gold pen right back there, which you can't see now, I guess, or maybe you can. It's there on that filing cabinet. Why did people, move to the next one. This is another heritage trail in New Zealand. Why did people and governments make monuments to the first discovery of gold or the lucky strike at dusty road stops in the Klondike of Canada, the Otago goldfields of New Zealand, and what's called Sovereign Hill in Australia? I can't tell you that story right now, but I can later if anyone wants to know. My answer is in part that remembering a lucky strike version of gold mining erases its environmental destruction and its colonial violence and its ongoing violence. Focusing on the romance of gold mining, memorialized in memoirs, fiction, theme parks, is part of a wider erasure of waste, destruction, and dispossession, colonial dispossession. So far, I've traveled to many places in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, fewer in Canada, because I was supposed to do that over the last year, in search of stories of gold. I've come across many stories that recount how the search for gold transformed the land and peoples in context of empire. And some of these stories focus on the lure of the lucky strike, kind of like almost providential story in rocks and streams, and others more directly tie the miner to the heroic task of building a new nation or even a new democracy along the way. In my paper, I talk about how there are stories, these stories are broadening now to include Chinese miners that used to not be part of the story, women, indigenous people. You can see this sort of narrative slowly changing at some of these sites. But the public memory of gold mining is rooted in a Christian and colonial cosmology of land that's deeply connected to spiritual ideas of waste. So in the British Empire, the monarch's right to rule over lands that were very, very distant from their own ancestral territories was most powerfully landed in the idea of what's called crown tenure. It's a legal fiction, a creation story that held that all lands belonged, at least in a sense, both spiritual, temporal, and secular in relation to the land, to the monarch. So the rise of colonialism extended crown tenure across the ocean to a monarch's supposed possessions, using such concepts as underlying title, crown land. I'll have a whole chapter on crown land in my book, and the idea of wastelands, interestingly. The crown claimed that all land, including the forests growing from it and the minerals buried in it, were its own, belonged to the crown. In North America, this is of course a hugely bold claim that is very contested by indigenous legal, not just legal theories, legal orders. In North America, governments, missionaries, surveyors, and mining companies also worked with a cosmology of land shaped by a dual commitment to the reality of property, that property is a real thing, and to the possibility of commodifying matter. In the days of gold rushes, they ignored indigenous claims to sovereignty over their land, and more recently, they have treated indigenous claims in the Canadian context. They've treated indigenous claims that land is sacred, claims made both by indigenous and settler law, as views that need to be worked around to accommodate what they consider to be the rational and economically necessary industry of mining. Mining companies in the Canadian state, however, have also claimed land with recourse to spiritualized power, and that's what I want to think about it more in my book. They invest minerals with more than just economic value. Anthropologist Julie Cruikshank has analyzed narrative genres of gold discovery as heritage, the narrative of the lucky strike, with a specific focus on the origin stories, or what she calls the epitomizing events of the Klondike gold rush. And she considers both settler and indigenous narratives, largely Tagish narratives, including oral histories she did with two women who were elders who actually knew key players in the story of the lucky strike of the Klondike gold rush. She argues that a critical handling of the symbolic and mythical elements, end quote, in both written and oral accounts of discovery narratives can destabilize the privileged status of colonial documentary texts of the origins of the gold rush. And in these next slides, I adapt her insights to one particular historical plaque celebrating the discovery of gold, showing how the actual fixity of the metal plaque bolted to the rock changes over time. So it's kind of a palimpsest of revised memory that scholars do that work. It's also on websites, it's a virtual palimpsest, but it's also personal. It's also about personal memory, which revises the meaning of the plaque even as it remains fixed there in place. Now, I haven't been able to go back to this site, but I was there when I was 6. So there's me and my brothers at the discovery claim of the Klondike Gold Rush. I've transcribed what it says on the claim on the side there. Basically does say that some Tagish men were part of this original claim of the Klondike Gold Rush. It entirely erases the woman who was there too, Kate, who was the sister of the man who comes to be called Skookum Jim, and she was the wife of George Carmack, the white man. George Carmack ends up getting the bulk of the claim and registering it because he's a white man, and they worried that the indigenous men would not actually be able to register their claim because they would not be considered legal subjects able to do that. So this is where the personal memory part comes in. My father was very interested in being a prospector, and we all had our own gold pans, and he was also a teacher. In the summertime, we traveled to the Yukon one year and panned for gold in many streams. And I've long pondered why we did that. And I think this book is partly trying to answer that question. So in terms of the palimpsest argument, every time there's a plaque, they have to give reasons for why they put that plaque up there. And that's one of the sources that I'm trying to sort of use to think about this commemorating the Lucky Strike idea. So the reasons in 1981, they sort of revised that plaque, which was put up in 1971, I believe. In 1981, they try to revise by the website, the metal plaque, by saying that this site marks the, quote, beginning of the development of Yukon, as if nobody was developing it before then. For Aboriginal people, this piece of land is an affirmation of their cultural values and worldview. That is not explored, what that would mean. But then from a Western perspective, the site affirms the 19th century belief that through hard work and perseverance, one could rise from poverty to riches. Interestingly, in 1994, this man, Skookum Jim, or Keish, which is his Tlingit name, becomes designated as a national historic person by the Canadian government. I'm still working on figuring out that some more. This is Keish and his wife and daughter. So by looking at the sort of layers of history that get put onto this story of the Lucky Strike, we can sort of do what Julie Cruikshank argues we need to do, is sort of pull apart various versions of this story of the Lucky Strike, the discovery. So in her words, the trenchant theme in these Western narratives about the gold rush is undeniably the struggle for hegemony and expansionist propaganda. Oh, sorry, I can't see the full thing because your face is on there. You can read it. But basically thinking about how the myths of individualism and the good Indian justify the destruction of indigenous lifeways and indigenous sovereignty. And then from the oral tradition, we have other stories that she very helpfully has brought up. So the overarching goal of my project is to think about how this idea of the discovery claim, which is in some ways a sort of legal regulatory act of saying, yes, I'm the first person who had the Lucky Strike, who discovered gold, needs to be set in this much wider legal landscape of how land is understood in colonial context, but also through indigenous legal orders, and then step back from that to ask the question of why is it that the gold rush continues to be such a rich vein of memory, of nation building, and of sort of romanticizing and erasure of colonial violence. But it is definitely a highly masculinized narrative as well, which is going to be part of what I'm thinking about. So I think I will end there, and we'll be happy to hear the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I think we can directly hand over to Annika Kirbis.
Hello, I will try to share my screen. Okay. Yeah,
we can see it.
Okay, so my presentation is entitled Following the Brick, Unruly Imperial Legacies and Heritagisation in Vienna. Vienna's past as the former heart of the Habsburg monarchy reverberates in multiple ways in the city's fabrics. The well-preserved architectural and monumental legacies of the empire coin Vienna city center, as well as the city's touristic positioning and marketing strategies. In fact, the entire inner city has been granted status as UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2001. The careful preservation of both tangible and more intangible forms of imperial heritage have and had a profound impact on the spatial composition and experience of Vienna, and affect the acceptability of visions for the city's future. If, according to Heidi Geismar, quote, heritage is a fundamental process of value creation, quote end, then what is being preserved are only those parts considered valuable. Thus, also Vienna's imperial heritage tends to capture only selected traces of the imperial past, particularly when considering the asymmetric relations of imperial power. One ring whose lives and pasts are worth remembering or considered disposable, representative buildings, artworks, and monuments commissioned by the ruling imperial class and protected as heritage today, can therefore only account for a limited version of the imperial past. While neglected and uncomfortable histories are mostly already present, the entanglements in surfacing are often less straightforward, with both attention and appreciation diverted from them. While tourist crowds marvel at the meticulously preserved monumental buildings in Vienna's historic city center, the histories of labor migrants, the harsh social and working conditions, and the environmental impact of the brickworks, compressed in each brick, are successfully obscured by nostalgic narratives promoted on Vienna's heavily commodified imperial past. Considering that the construction sector in Vienna traditionally depended on migrant labor, not only after the Second World War with the migration of so-called guest workers, but already during the Habsburg Empire and Vienna's building boom in the mid-19th century, is how I became interested in bricks. So I turned to the sites of former Habsburg brickworks in Vienna's peripheral south that provided the material resources for realizing the Habsburg architectural dreams, valued and protected as heritage today. In fact, the bricks with the imprinted double-headed eagle of the Habsburgs are displayed in a few museums and heritage sites. However, the stories of the migrant workers employed in the brickworks, so-called Ziegelböhmen, and the ruined landscape left after the brickworks decay following the First World War are commonly omitted in the narrative. Particularly the work of, before moving to the ethnographic details, I just refer briefly to the conceptual framing. So the work of Anne Stoller and Anat Singh and their emphasis on ruins and processes of renation to enhance our understanding of imperial and colonial formations in the present, as well as the possibilities emerging from renation, have been very helpful for me. While ruins often conjure imperial nostalgia as, quote, icons of romantic loss and longing, certified by their status as heritage protected sites, Stoller instead focuses on imperial ruins, not as, quote, inert remains, but those settling into the social and material ecologies in which people live and survive. The acceleration and scale of the production of ruined landscapes and livelihoods in the Anthropocene increasingly complicates to hold on to a definition of heritage purely based on the idea of curation and human intention. According to Olsen and Petersdottir, in light of the, quote, unintentional monuments and involuntary memories accumulating around us, quote end, in the Anthropocene, processes of renation and waste, usually considered threats to heritage preservation, may in fact be equally regarded as a form of heritage. Particularly, the stubborn persistence and uncontrolled surfacing of waste is suggestive of agency beyond the human, and thus casts doubt on confining the definition of heritage to simply valued pasts. This form of involuntary imperial heritage I encountered in the area of former Habsburg brickworks, which transformed from an abandoned post-imperial wasteland to a declared natural monument. Since Vienna's times as a Roman settlement, the Wienerberg mountain ridge was known for its rich clay deposits. In 1819, the Wienerberger Brick Company was founded, which over the course of a few decades turned into Europe's largest brick producer. With the fall of the Habsburg Empire following the First World War, the brickwork industry entered a critical phase from which it never recovered. The decreasing profitability of clay extraction and replacement of bricks with cement in the construction sector eventually led to the closure of Vienna's brickworks in the 1960s. The Wienerberger Company by now turned into a multinational enterprise that remains the world's largest clay brick producer. The arduous work of brick production in quasi-serfdom at the Wienerberger clay pits was largely borne by migrant workers from the regions of Bohemia and Moravia, referred to as Ziegelböhmen, who made up the main part of the brickworks labor force. It is through their engagement that makes the area of the former Habsburg brickworks also an important site for the labor rights movement in Vienna. Enabling large profits for the Wienerberger Company and shaping Vienna's aesthetics, after the fall of the Habsburg monarchy, the soil in the former sites of clay excavation was seen as economically useless, especially after test drillings for oil and gas in the 1930s and 60s that proved largely unproductive. What remained was a wasteland of deserted factory ruins and vast areas of extracted land, cracked with clay pits, filling up with precipitation and groundwater. Such conditions made the area unsuitable for construction. Perceived as aesthetically unappealing, this landscape soon invited the formation of dumping sites for debris from the Second World War, household waste and the like, whose legacies of pollution still linger on until today. So how did this post-imperial wasteland turn into a declared natural monument in 1995? While according to Matthew Gandy, quote, wastelands exist in dynamic tension with human intentionality, whether in terms of their preservation or their erasure, quote end, a look at human agency alone cannot explain this landscape transformation. Considered economically and aesthetically worthless by humans for decades, this use of this landscape was reduced to temporary, unofficial reappropriation for human leisure activities, ranging from children roaming around in the ruins to motorbike races, as well as swimming in the ponds. And in a somewhat more bizarre moment in the 1920s, the deserted wasteland served in fact as backdrop for film projects by Vienna's first major film studio, Sasha Films. These epic films required large outdoor spaces in order to accommodate the thousands of supernumeraries for the shooting of mass scenes, as well as for realizing the colossal stage design and costumes. The brief filmic career of the abandoned clay pits points to the tendency with which peripheral landscapes without any declared use and value often become, quote Gandy, places of reverie. Yet projecting stories of siege, invasion, and biblical apocalypse on the deserted wasteland also testifies to the limits of human imagination. In the 1970s, environmentalists and natural scientists started to notice that the spontaneous vegetation and, quote Gandy, unintentional nature emerging from the ruins of the Habsburg bricks have evolved into a biotope unique in Austria, considering the particular chemical composition of the clay soil, as well as the rare transitional character of the landscape with the seasonal flooding and drying up of the clay pits. They recognize the distinctiveness and irreplaceability of what became known as clay pit landscape, or in German Ziegelgrubenlandschaft. The comparatively high levels of salinity and sulfate concentration in the water caused by the clay soil allows for the thriving of rare algal assemblages that cannot be found anywhere else in Austria. In the following, the area became regarded as endangered due to increasing building activity. Eventually, in the 1970s, Vienna's municipality redeveloped the area for retreat and recreation. The former wasteland rapidly evolved to host a new habitat for a variety of animal and plant species, so that in 1995, some 90 hectares became protected as natural monument. In the 1970s, with the development of the field of urban ecology, wastelands became increasingly regarded as key to urban biodiversity instead of seemingly unproductive and empty sites. By turning the remnants of empire into the components for a new ecosystem, I propose that non-human agency and multi-species collaboration are key to understand this process of landscape recovery and heritagisation. And as quote Singh, zones of neglect, quote end, human abandonment of the post-imperial wasteland proved to be much more effective than any human-guided intervention. The unique landscape condition of the brickworks wasteland allowed for rare interspecies entanglements emerging from the imperial ruins, which enabled the human re-evaluation of the landscape through the value of biodiversity. The soil deemed valueless for decades suddenly was recognized as a resource for enabling biodiverse environments and forms of life as well as an area for retreat and recreation for urban dwellers. Thus, the transformation of the post-imperial wasteland to a declared natural monument illustrates that, quote Olsen and Petersdottir, the survival of the past and thus what becomes heritage is not solely an outcome of human care and implemented regimes of preservation, but depends on a number of agents, also independent of human control and selective remembering. The perspective of waste and wasteland may thus facilitate to develop a notion of heritage that takes into account those past and futures previously considered valueless and disposable, and thus moves from curation to care, including both human and non-human actors. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annika. And let us pass from Vienna to New York. And
greetings, everyone. I wish I were in New York. I'm in St. Louis, but I'll take you to New York. I'm pleased to be here, and I've learned a lot already from this conversation. For context, I'm a cultural historian. I'm embedded in an art and design school at Washington University in St. Louis, and my work largely concerns the material cultural politics of memory in late 19th and early 20th century urban America. So the paper I've circulated is part of a larger project in which I am seeking to recover the long material and folkloric histories of urban sites that have been subjects of dark fixation. My priority is to explore their cultural and epistemological significance as deeply fraught and contradictory places, sites of alternately vigorous memorialization and forgetting, sacralization and violent erasure, waste and neglect, but also compulsive rebuilding, and also, importantly, a host of informal acts of use and reuse, storytelling, and reclamation. Hart Island epitomizes this category of material heritage. Part of the Long Island Sound, it is home to the nation's largest potter's field, at least 1 million burials, probably that's a major undercount, mostly located in unmarked mass graves, and a place that has long been a dark spot, stigmatized by a tangled history of violence, secrecy, and neglect. Its stigma is a product in part of the island's association with pauperism and disease, and its function as a repository of externalized waste associated with New York City's reform and penal institutions. Besides the city's public cemetery, Hart Island has housed a low-security prison, which was built from the remnants of a military barracks turned prisoner of war camp during the US Civil War, a convalescent hospital and tuberculosis sanitarium, a women's asylum, a reformatory for, quote, wayward boys, a drug treatment facility, and a Nike missile silo. Each of these has produced mounds of refuse, literal and figurative, not just human remains, ruined buildings, and piles of moldering paper documents which proliferate on the site, but unrecovered and mostly, I think, unrecoverable stories of human suffering and loss. Attending to this complex material history, the paper I've circulated probes Hart Island's negative heritage character, arguing that the site, now stewarded by the city's Parks Department, might yet become a locus of recuperative memory and even restorative justice, although the latter is not yet articulated in the paper I circulated. Despite its status as a wounded place, I contend Hart Island's unruly materialities nevertheless constitute what Walter Hood calls, quote, the detritus of diverse cultural origins, which, if imaginatively engaged, might yet serve as evidence not just of the histories of exclusion and harm, but of what he calls communal resilience, faith, optimism, and invention. So the paper begins with an episode of humiliation for the Department of Corrections, a mass drug poisoning of 45 inmates from the School of Wayward Boys in 1915, which exposed to public view the failure of the state to care for its human inmates, and by extension, the facilities of its reformatories. The episode also exposed what many saw as the underlying condition, material and social disorder, of the city's island correctional system, which includes Rikers Island, Randall's Island, and several other islands. The DOC's own administrators frequently complained of crowding, sanitation problems, deteriorating facilities, challenges with discipline and disease, and so on, all of them issues that had been sources of tremendous anxiety and concern for New Yorkers for the better part of a half a century. In fact, just a few weeks after the poisoning episode that I mentioned in the paper, typhoid hit the island for the third summer in a row, forcing 800 inmates into quarantine and triggering yet another investigation that uncovered pollution of the beaches, poorly drained sewage, and a great number of flies that had encouraged the spread of the disease. This fearsome set of material and social realities continues to haunt New Yorkers today. At the height of the city's pandemic lockdown late last spring, as you probably recall, residents of the city and the world were again confronted by scandalizing reports from Hart Island, this time related to the interment of COVID victims in the island's Potter's Field. Like those who read about the poisoning a century earlier, few had visited the site, which remains as heavily guarded as a carceral site as it was in 1915. Yet many were transfixed by satellite photos and drone footage showing bulldozers carving large burial trenches on the island and crews in hazmat suits unloading in the coffins. These were new, uncomfortable images, yet they seemed somehow familiar, like scenes recollected from a dream. In an effort to bring hazy memories into focus, press accounts offered readers thumbnail accounts of the more dark or grisly elements of the island's history, emphasizing its bleak and desolate landscape and its function as a mass burial site, particularly during epidemics. Despite the ongoing concerns about the city's management of COVID response, these accounts had surprisingly little to say about the state's role as longtime keeper of the island and its associated correctional facilities, much less why a site where so many New Yorkers have labored, died, and been buried over 150 years is now so thoroughly disgraced and disfigured. This seeing but not seeing typifies many journalistic accounts from the last century, which I trace in the longer version of this paper. These accounts have fixated on Hart Island's infamy and profanity, its unruly material and social realities, and the abjection of its inmates, both living and dead. But these accounts have also struggled to find critical insight or a sense of moral obligation to the site, the public institutions it houses, and its legacies. While its status as a place of slow violence and neglect has often been confronted, as in 2015 when descendants filed a class action suit to gain access to their descendants' graves, to their ancestors' graves, which they had long been denied, the island remains a place shrouded in forgetfulness, uncertainty, and shame. It lingers like a dark spot in our peripheral vision, as one scholar evocatively characterizes islands that serve as, quote, cultural repositories of marginalized memories, but also projections of our collective unconscious. Hart Island is a site not only of repression, but of estrangement, where we are forced to confront remainders of a past that does not properly belong to us, yet begs for recognition. As I've argued elsewhere, such sites often suffer not only from devaluation, but moral interpretive uncertainty, visual and material indeterminacy, and thus they occupy ambiguous positions in the local imaginaries of place and the regimes of public memory. Hart Island's acute estrangement is a product of its long history of social, political, and material violence, and a host of powerful but distorting representations, both narrative and visual. Both have contributed to its negative heritage status, a phrase I use to refer to haunting material folkloric remainders of dark or problematic histories that nonetheless become shared elements of collective memory and even sources of collective fixation. Whether encountered as discrete artifacts, historical narratives, memorial projects, or more elusive remnant landscapes, negative heritage sites are both lieux de mémoire and domains of forgetting. As we see with Hart Island, they may allure and compel the work of historical memory, while yet hastening a kind of fixation and fixity in the way that Pamela has just used that term, not unlike alchemical processes which set out to, quote, reduce a volatile spirit or essence to a permanent bodily form. Why are Hart Island's remainders so troubling, its spirits so volatile? For one, it has always suffered from a degree of material, political, and determinacy. It was allegedly purchased by an Englishman in 1654 from an indigenous group referred to problematically as the Siwanoi, said to be affiliated with the Lenape people, an oddly shaped isle that was considered a common fishing and hunting ground and later became a place for extra-legal activities such as duels and boxing matches. During the Civil War, the land was acquired by the federal government, who rapidly converted it into a training camp for the Union Army, including one all-Black regiment. Many of the recruits who mustered there turned out to be drunkards, rebel spies, refugees, and fugitives from justice, as well as, quote, imbeciles and lunatics cajoled into service. Thus began the island's association with outcasts, deviant behavior, especially inebriation, and the regimes of state power. Its reputation only worsened when hundreds of Confederate soldiers held in a POW camp on the island died of disease and malnutrition and were buried in a mass grave. Despite later efforts to dignify the site, for instance by erecting a monument to the Union dead, the island soon came to be associated with abject burial and disease. The city's official reason for acquiring it after the war was to create a branch of the industrial school for destitute boys on Randall's Island, which suffered from overcrowding. Besides its modest price, the island had other advantages, including an existing infrastructure and a degree of remoteness that suited it for quarantine purposes. A potter's field must have always been intended as well, given the growing agitation for new burial sites spurred by the cemetery reform and sanitation movements, which, among other things, targeted public burying grounds for their seepage and rank corruption. City Cemetery, a dedicated 4-acre section of Hart Island, saw burials immediately upon creation in 1869, whereas the Union soldiers buried earlier had been given headstones and individual graves. The new arrivals were said to have been buried helter-skelter without any record or any system, and in a spot where the wind howled furiously, and in every gale the spray flies over and wets the new-made graves. The troubles were more than atmospheric. Its early caretakers, the Department of Public Charities and Correction, approached the island as a set of resources to be exploited in conjunction with the changing needs of its correctional facilities, which led to exceedingly irregular land management and constant disrespect of the cemetery sites. While sections were consecrated for Roman Catholic and Protestant burials, the demarcation between those two broke down and last rites were usually not administered. Burials were hasty and Spartan. Coffins stained with blood were rudely transferred from the city morgue to a ferry and thence to a wagon, later a flatbed truck, that would carry them into the field where they would be laid 3 deep in trenches of 150 adults each. Many, many times more that in the case of the children's section. If they were told at all, families often learned of interment long after it had occurred, and efforts to reclaim bodies or visit grave sites were particularly difficult. Hart Island developed a reputation as a fearsome place, especially amongst residents of state institutions who knew that a pauper burial would likely be their fate. The bleak landscape with its uneven, rocky coastline and large mounds of disturbed soil compounded the mortification factor. Potter's fields are generally seen as places of bodily and moral abjection where, quote, dignified burial is compromised and social oblivion is likely. These were the same troubling spirits conjured by pandemic-related reporting last summer, which fretted especially over the mass burial scenario on the island. So in the paper, I'm going to just jump ahead a little bit and say a few words about the sort of material conditions of the island now. It has been inconsistently managed, and its custodianship has passed between several different government agencies over the course of a century. And the efforts to manage and maintain the site have been compromised not only by policies of secrecy, but by inadequate funds and also a kind of legacy of ad hoc improvement, which has made it unclear what the priorities should be going forward for maintaining the islands. In addition to that, it has been subject to exceedingly harsh weather effects and erosion. Most famously, Superstorm Sandy caused serious damage to the island's burial landscape and essentially further disgraced the cemetery as a site of mass burial. In addition, as you can see in in the paper, the longer paper, I trace some of the history of its visual and narrative representation, including its important account by Jacob Riis in 1890, the reformist photographer activist who sought to document the experiences of the most impoverished in New York City. I apologize for that. Can you hear that? That horn?
Yes, but we can also hear you.
Okay, that's my car alarm going off, but I'm just gonna pretend that it's not happening. And finish. Sorry about that, it's very distracting. The Jacob Riis photos, amongst many others that I consider in the longer paper, play an important role in fixing the island's condition of estrangement in the minds of New Yorkers, and essentially provide a kind of repertoire of visual imagination that becomes kind of central to the way in which New Yorkers experience the site, have experienced the site over the last 100 years. And in tellingly, those representations resurface in the journalistic accounts of COVID burials as those describing the activities on the island sought to make sense of this longer history and this sort of darker set of legacies that New Yorkers have inherited. And so with that, I will simply say, as by way of ending, that the project will, in its fullest form, to give fuller consideration to some of the memory and political activism that have happened on and around the island, including the campaign to ease restrictions of access to the site, and the ongoing efforts at recognition and recuperative memory work, most notably by descendants, as I mentioned before, but also Heart Island Project collaborators who've made an effort to recognize the island's complex material, social, institutional, industrial, and even ecological heritage, all of which represent the slow awakening of a moral imagination, not only for this site, which is hiding in plain view, probably one of the most valuable undeveloped pieces of property in New York State, or sort of semi-developed, I guess I should say, but also to reconnect with the history of its 1 million+ residents, many of whom were treated as marginal, both in life and death. And I argue that these awakenings are the foundation of potential recuperative memory work and communal truth-telling, and even potentially restorative justice. The fact that the island is intact to some degree means that it yet could be engaged in that fashion, and the folkloric elements of its history could be reconnected to its material remnants. So let me just add simply.
If we can conclude, because we are already over the time limit, and we should like.
No, I apologize. Yeah, no, I'll
no worries.
2 more sentences. Despite its status as a wounded and stigmatized place, Heart Island's negative heritage might yet be embraced by New Yorkers, as they have done with other negative heritage locations. And that would be the beginning of a process that I described earlier, which is to say reclaiming the detritus of diverse cultural origins, and the evidence of not only exclusion, suffering, and violence, but communal resilience, faith, optimism, and invention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now hand over to Jelena Romashko for the final presentation of this panel.
Hello. I will try to share my screen. Okay. Can you see it?
We can see it.
Okay, very good. So, 1 second. Yeah. So I'm very happy to present in front of you today. I will tell you a little bit about myself and my project. So I I come from the religious studies, and I'm a PhD student, and I'm working on generally on religious imagery about Chernobyl. And so my two main interests are religion and images, but for today's conference, I was very inspired and very excited to think about what happens in Chernobyl in a little bit different terms and share with you sort of an overview. I was very excited to try all these three terms: waste, energies, and spirits. What will happen if we apply them to the post-Chernobyl situation? So, and I will share with you this overview today. So I will start with the introduction, where I wanted to talk a little bit about radiation and human sensorium. So one of my informants, my interview partner, Ivan, who relocated from the contaminated after Chernobyl land, told me a story how he remembers when he was a child, he was coming back home in the evening, and he saw some movement, and he got scared, and he thought at that moment that the spirit of the forest was climbing over the fence of his house. And he spent quite a long time telling me not about the fact of what happened, but of this puzzling state of heightened attention, how he tried to sharpen all of his senses to understand what happened, to understand if it was a cat jumping on the fence, or somebody climbing over the fence to steal something from the house, or was it some garden equipment that just fell and made noise, and how he was trying through all his senses to distinguish these shapes behind the shadows and to define their origin. And when I was listening to him, I thought that what he's describing for me means a lot of how I understand what materiality of religion is, how we understand what material object and distinguishing between tangible and intangible means for people who study religion. So in this case, I thought that his story is very much a good metaphor to demonstrate what happened to the locals when Chernobyl happened, and what is this narrative about post-Chernobyl materiality of religion. Because people there, they were sharpening all of their senses, trying to distinguish natural from supernatural, the living from dead, human from non-human, and organic from non-organic. And if we picture the next day, what happened when he was talking to his family about what happened in the night, we could see two processes happening. One of them I could call basically the religion, because if we use the approach of Thomas Tweed, he argued that religion is first of all a homemaking, when we establish boundaries between human and superhuman domains. So and we establish these rules and occasions where crossing is happening and how this crossing is negotiated. And the second thing that would be developed in next day when people in the village talk about these experiences would be something which for this paper I can call creation of emic new materialities. So basically something that how people understand non-human agents, how people from their emic perspective talk about non-organic presence of radiation in their life. So as you know, radiation is intangible. Through human sensorium, we can't sense it, and it's a long-term process. You can see the southern Gomel region of Belarus and the map from 1986 and the map from 2056. You see that contamination is ongoing. It's becoming less, but it's still very much present. And to comprehend that is a very difficult thing for the locals who mostly, at least in those areas closer to the Chernobyl power plant, where rural citizens without the education which could assist them in understanding the scientific part of the story. Yeah. So, and here I would like to say that the fact that radiation is invisible, tasteless, and quiet agent, it is also able to possess and inhabit other objects, spaces, and bodies. And this characteristic allows for its rapid redefinition from a natural phenomenon into a supernatural one, placing it in the realm of spirits. However, the information briefed to the local by scientists placed it on the borderline between nature and technology, suggesting to rather frame it as waste or an energy. And it was explained to the locals that they experienced inorganic matter that went out of control. And and I would like, I really don't like words. I like images much more. And I think that words do not do justice to it. I would like to show you images that created by locals, by people who were affected by the Chernobyl disaster, and how they express the experience of interacting with inorganic presence of material, of radiation, of non-human agent. And here you can see on the triptych Harvest by Christina Katrakis, you can see the mythological reapers in gas mask harvesting bloody crops, and a Prussian blue beast of radiation wraps the human embryo with his tongue. These are the supernatural creatures, non-organic beasts, and human fetus engage in the same space, seen under blue, red, and monochrome lenses. And the blue beast you can see here, yeah, the eye, the mouth, the teeth, and the tongue, and here you can see the fetus in the tongue. And next imagery would be by Alexander Kishenko, who made a tapestry, an enormous tapestry. It's kept in New York now, and it is, you can see the imagery is really unexpected from sort of an atheistic state, which Soviet Union was at the time. You can see a lot of religious imagery. You can see that the space over the shiny metallic squares of the power plant floors are is inhabited by flying angels with snake radiating from snake radiating as rays, and jumping red roosters and spiky fish, and Mother of God flying all over them. So this combination of imagery, religious and secular and technological, is something we see in artworks which were produced in the area. And one of my informants says, Chernobyl as a tragedy is an incomprehensible and intangible evil that excluded many lands from their normal existence and drove people away from the places where their grandparents and ancestors lived. Radiation has become a kind of mythological creature that haunts and causes misfortune and disease. And we already saw some ideas of mythological creature. Here's one more painting of Katrakis that I wanted to share with you, where you can see that she's displaying also this blue beast who is taking a child from her womb. And this is basically a story of her losing her child from the illness, which was from her understanding related to the radiation exposure. She was 5 years old, close to the nuclear power plant when she was exposed to radiation. And so with this intangible evil, how could people communicate the experience of interacting with it? So this is one of the beasts, yeah, one of the mythological creatures. In the Harvest, we saw also the same form revealed. But here's another artist, Maria Primachenko, who also lived within the exclusion zone around Chernobyl, and she was so-called primitivist painter, and she was the naive painter, and she painted atoms and very many different other imagery created devoted to Chernobyl. But this one is devoted to Chernobyl and nuclear war, where she says that we need to have image of of atom to understand what it is, and she depicts what it is for her. And you can see that this imagery is very much not technological or scientific imagery. So, and then when I was thinking about all of that, when I was thinking how we frame and how locals framed this new materialities and this organic and inorganic actors in the post-Chernobyl development, I thought, okay, but what calls visitors to Chernobyl? Because now Chernobyl tourism is a very much discussed topics. And first I thought about energies and wastelands. And in my understanding, energies that call visitors to the exclusion zone are something which calls scientists. They want to study radiation. They want to understand how radiation impacts the nature around it. And waste is something which attracts waste and wastelands, and something which attracts people who are very much interested in Chernobyl representation and shooting computer games and alike culture. Yeah, and here you can see a number of images which I think advertise the exclusion zone as a wasteland, as a nuclear wasteland, to attract visitors to there. But because I'm in religious studies, for me, for sure, for a very long time, the non-human agent that called visitors to the zone was spirits. And here you can see the day of the commemoration of dead, which was throughout the 30 years after the Chernobyl explosion, the only day when people were allowed in the zone. And this is the days where locals were returning to their homes, to the cemeteries, to bring new ritual towels on the graves, on crosses, to meet their kins and to commemorate Chernobyl disaster. And you can see how this one day when the zone was opened was a religious day and was centered around religious events, which is surprising for many. So I would conclude, I suppose, with the idea that many things and sites have been abandoned in the exclusion zone, but not graves. When nature took its turn and occupied the formerly human domain, human graves stayed as placeholders and sacred human spaces. Therefore, within the first 30 years, not the waste, but the spirits drew crowds into the zone. Spirits of the forefathers who were visited during Radovanović, the day of rejoicing, and invited to the refugees' new, and the spirits also were invited to the refugees' new houses on another religious holiday called Zedi. Humans claimed their land and marked their presence in the exclusion zone by putting new ritual towels on crosses, by maintaining the graves and meeting their kins there. Humans are not willing to leave this land, neither to the natural colonizers, energies, or wilderness, nor to the supernatural, non-human spirits and demonic entities. Yeah, so this was my short overview. I hope I didn't go very much over time. Thank you very much.